Hey everybody, I'm Light and I'll be going over how to use the chalk brush for portraits in Clip Studio Paint today. And there's so much to get through in this tutorial, so I will get right into it. So without further ado, let's get into the tutorial. So the first section is over the chalk brush, and just a little bit about that brush. So the chalk brush is one of the most versatile brushes in Clip Studio Paint. It's super easy to use, and I highly recommend it as a go-to beginner brush because it's so textured and smooth to use. Secondly, the gouache brush is a perfect pair to the chalk brush because it's similarly smooth while also having a bit of a painterly texture. Following that, I would also like to talk about shading with chalk. Now, shading with the chalk brush is really simple to do just because of how textured this brush is. See, as I try and shade this ball, it's already starting to look three-dimensional just because of that traditional texture that the chalk brush gives it. See, this brush really pulls out the texture and the color and the depth of what we're painting and what we're looking at, and that really makes all the difference in a brush. What makes the chalk brush so useful for beginners is just how simple it is to use, with how easy it is to just make things look a little bit more three-dimensional or a little bit more textured. Okay, so the fourth part of using the chalk brush is blending. Blending is a really important thing with any brush. So for this brush, what I'm going to do is lightly lay down some flat colors of a dark blue and a lighter blue, and this sort of makes a sky palette of sorts. You can see how it's already starting to blend when I just go over it with the brush once. And this is really important to any sort of blending tutorial, but just how simply this brush blends just by running over it a few times with the same colors. It just perfectly blends, almost like watercolor paints do in traditional art. Now, this is so much more beautiful to look at than a standard gradient palette. And that's one of the best things about the chalk brush, is just how it stands out with its textures. Well, now I'm going to lightly go over with some white chalk to sort of make this clouds that will add to this white sky, And then I'm going to add in clouds. And clouds are super easy to draw with the chalk brush using a method of dabbing at the page to add in some dots and some extra content. And then I'll add in some darker colors and some darker hues to shade these clouds, but again, using this chalk brush to give it that puffy look. And this brush works seamlessly every time for using clouds and making sky and landscapes. It's my default brush for landscapes. Also, the gouache brushes work really well for landscapes also, seeing as they blend in perfectly with the bottom, and you can roughly sketch in clouds in a matter of seconds. And this is one of the best things about the gouache brushes and the chalk brushes, is just how seamlessly they work together. Now that all the basics is over with, I'm going to get into my personal portrait process, and it's a little bit of a long one, but first, I like to always go through and make a sketch. And this sketch can be anything. It doesn't even have to be a portrait. If it were a landscape, the same general processes would apply. But for sakes of this tutorial, I am making a portrait, and it's a pretty simple one. What I'm working on is a simple portrait of a girl, and it works pretty well. That's that. Overall, it turns out really nice looking, and it's done very quickly. Well, the most important thing about this tutorial is that I'm shading and making my sketch with the chalk brush, and that I'm intentionally leaving it a little bit messy. Also, instead of using that standard black for my outlines, I want to use some darker red tones. These tones really add to the piece, making it really stand out. So, in this case, I'm going to lightly go over it with some dark reds, and then I'm going to make it transparent, and this is going to be the underlying sketch for my piece. Now that that's all finished, I'm going to begin on the stage of coloring. And the first thing I like to do when I'm coloring is to add in some light watercolors. And these usually come from banks on Clip Studio Assets, which I'll link in the description. And then I put them over my sketch. And I make them a little bit transparent. I like to default to 30 or 40% transparency, but your personal preference will determine how transparent you want it to be. So on this one, I made it 39% transparency, and I chose a lighter pink, which would affect my palette choices. So when I start to color this girl, I'll want her to contrast with the light pink. So I'm going to start making my line art for this girl, and there are two ways you can do it. I usually make my line art on top of the transparency and then move it underneath at the end. But you can make the line art underneath the light pink portrait or the light pink watercolor paints if that works well for you. I personally like to see the dark colors of my line art since it really shows me what I'm doing and what I'm not doing, so I can just clarify the shape language a little bit. But really, it's all up to your personal preference on what you do. I just highly recommend you add in that extra watercolor piece, which I'll again link in the description, because it just really adds that extra flair to it. And since the brush pack I'm talking about and that watercolor set, since those cost a little bit extra in Clippy tokens, which you may not have, you can also make content like this really easily. It's just a matter of a few strokes with a chalk brush or with the watercolor sets that Clip Studio offers by default. And perhaps I'll make another tutorial on how exactly to make those splotches of watercolor, but those ones are pretty easy to figure out. Basically, go wild. If you have a little sibling, just let them go crazy with color, and you'll end up with something that's definitely pretty close. So that's always really fun to do. Well, now I am working on my line art, just touching it up, and the best thing to do with the chalk brush is leave the line art a little messy. You can get away with so much messiness with the chalk brush, and it will look so nice. Like for this one, my eyes and my eyebrows, they're intentionally left a little bit messy because it just adds that extra effect. The most important thing to look for when making line art with a chalk brush, I think, is to vary up your consistency and your texture and the length of your lines. So for example, I'm making the lines where her ears are and where those connect to her head a little bit thicker than I am the lines of the bridge of her nose or her lips, because these lines have a lot more shadow to them. So I like to make any line that will be thicker wherever there would be a shadow. You can see I do the same thing beneath her neck. I make that line very thick and it adds this sort of shadowy effect. Whereas I make the lines on her clothing where it's a little bit more lace-like, I make those ones a little bit thinner. And this contrast of line depth is what really makes a chalk drawing. And it makes a traditional drawing too. If you've done a lot of traditional art, I'm sure you've worked with varying line textures, because sometimes a thicker pencil will work better than a thinner one, and a thinner pencil is way better at capturing those details. And it's the same way with the chalk brush, except you can get away with a little bit more messiness. Well, the best thing about the chalk brush to me is how messy I can be, and I don't have to put in hours and hours to clean up these sketches and make them perfect line art. And that's another great thing about the chalk brush. It's so beginner friendly, where you don't have to put in a lot of time or effort to make something that looks amazing. And for someone like me, who's a full-time college student, I don't always have a lot of time to put into my personal artwork, but with brushes that'll save me time, it really helps me out a lot. Well, for this one, I am coloring in some lighter textures with the chalk brush, and this is just to add in some shadowing. And I'm adding these shadows with a dark brownish red, anywhere where I think there'll be some darker hues involved. So for this, I want to touch up on the top of her nose, I want to touch anywhere that's a little bit darker or a little bit redder, anything like that. So then I'm going to lightly go over and add that sort of water effect that you add when you're painting that just adds a little bit of texture to the piece and outlines where you're coloring and where you're not. So this is just coloring everything in with a lighter shade of peach, and then I can go through and change this color later without much problems. And also, I made my liner a little bit more red since I didn't quite like how dark it was looking. So I reddened it up a little bit. And you can see now that as I go through the skin and the art here, I'm just adding in these little bits of depth in these pieces. And I play around with color a bit, as I'm sure you're noticing, but I also want to focus on adding in some darker shadows, and I'll do this with a combination of the chalk brush and a little bit of these gouache brushes, but mostly the chalk brush, because I want this to have that messy, textured look to it. Sort of like hair is, where it just pops out a little bit. And then I'm going to lightly color in her eyes, and notice that I don't ever use a full white. And that's another thing that's really important. When you're doing anything with traditional styles, there'll never be a perfect white. There'll be light grays and light yellows, but there'll never be an exact white. So when you're trying to match these traditional aesthetics, just by using the exact color of white, you can't reach this aesthetic. So I like to use some duller tones oftentimes when I work on this. So some light yellows and some light oranges. And for this one's pretty orange and brown centric. Well, as I start to sketch in some of the details, you can notice I use a little bit of the gouache brushes to shade in the bows and the outfits, because I want that to be a little smoother than the rough textured hair shading. And I'm also using some chalk around her eyes, around her face, to just give some detail to her features and to everything about her. And this gives her a little bit more personality, I'd say, and a little bit more character. Well, following that, there's not a whole lot left to do in this piece. There's a few things I always like to do when I'm working on any sort of artwork piece, and those usually involve playing around with some hues and some saturation at the end and all of that good stuff. But before I do that, I go over a little bit more into the coloring, where I add some darker tones and some textures. I'm following a little bit of a color map, if you can't tell. I forget who it was that created this design, but there's always a little bit more yellow tones on your forehead and some more bluish tones on the bottom of your face. And so I'm starting to incorporate those too. And then I'm really liking how this blue contrasts with the brown. So I start to work it into her hair a bit more. And that's one of the best things about this messy chalk traditional style, is you can just go over it with some random colors and it will look super natural, because the chalk brush blends so easily. So when I add these colors in, I don't have to work at all to get them to just blend. And it's the smooth blending that's one of the best things about this chalk brush. So now I'm adding in some darker shadows with the chalk brush, and I want these to highlight a little bit about her character. And now to me, she's starting to look a little bit like an artist, I would say, a fantasy style artist with the bright colored hair, and I know that's a cliche, but it's this very bright looking sort of style. And with the more fantasy-esque style of her clothing, I can start to develop a character and a personality for her, all based on just this one little bit of style. And I'd say when you're working with more realistic portraits or more straight portraits, it's harder to get this super character-based style. But to me, she really shows a lot of personality and a lot of character with her hairstyles and just how she seems to carry herself. And that's one of the best things about these messier portraits. They just have more personality to them. Following that, I add in a little bit more cleanliness where I'm cleaning up some of her features, just a little bit more, adding in some more shading, darkening up some colors, and making sure that everything looks exactly perfect like I want it to look. And then I'll add those light backgrounds with the transparency, those watercolor ones, I'll add those back in over the line art. And I'll start to mess around with transparency, and sometimes it's not even needed anymore and you can delete it altogether. But afterwards, I also like to mess with saturation just to see what happens. And sometimes saturation is super important and other times it doesn't matter at all. But in this case, I feel like saturation really just helped shape the drawing and made it into something really amazing. And that's about all I have to cover in today's tutorial. Thank you for tuning in, paying attention, and I hope this helped you even just a little bit to understand a little bit more about the chalk brush, how it works, how you can use it. And I hope you can apply the chalk brush and those styles in your own artwork someday. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have a wonderful rest of your day.